By the time Abbey Road was recorded in 1969, the Beatles were no longer the same four young men who had conquered the world. The tension was heavy. Business arguments, creative clashes, and emotional distance had changed the chemistry that once made them unstoppable. But somehow, in the middle of all that chaos, they managed to craft one of the most polished, forward-thinking albums of their entire career. And for George Harrison, the quiet Beatle who had spent most of the decade fighting to be heard, one song stood out above the rest. It wasn't his own. It wasn't one of Lennon's introspective experiments either. It was a Paul McCartney song, one that George later called the most impressive track on Abbey Road. That song was "You Never Give Me Your Money." To understand why George singled out that particular song, you have to look at what Abbey Road represented. It was the Beatles' final proper recording together, their last chance to fix what had been broken during the Let It Be sessions. The group agreed, at least for a while, to put their differences aside and make a good album again. And out of that fragile truce came a masterpiece that blended artistry and technology better than anything before it. Paul McCartney arrived at those sessions with several fragments of unfinished songs, small musical ideas that didn't quite fit anywhere else. He began stitching them together into what would become the Abbey Road medley, a seamless chain of melodies flowing into one another, symbolizing the rise and fall of the Beatles themselves. "You Never Give Me Your Money" was the piece that began it all. The song was deeply personal. Paul had written it during one of the darkest periods in the band's history, when Apple Corps, their self-managed company, was falling apart financially. Arguments about management, lawyers, and contracts had turned the Beatles into businessmen rather than musicians. In the song, Paul poured out his frustration. "You never give me your money, you only give me your funny paper." A line that spoke directly to his exhaustion with endless paperwork and broken trust. It was part love song, part lament, part dream of escape. But musically, it was something far greater. The track begins gently, almost like a lullaby. Paul at the piano, his voice weary yet tender. Then, halfway through, it transforms. The rhythm shifts, guitars burst in, and the melody races forward into something hopeful and free. It was as if Paul was painting the emotional landscape of the Beatles' final chapter in real time. The sadness, the anger, the longing for something simpler. And George Harrison saw that. In interviews years later, George said, "You Never Give Me Your Money" was the moment that impressed him most on Abbey Road. He wasn't just praising Paul's melody, he was acknowledging the structure, the emotion, and the way it connected the fragments of the medley into one coherent story. George, who was always drawn to musical sophistication and meaning, admired how Paul blended multiple moods and time signatures into a single track without losing its soul. It wasn't flashy or forced, it was natural. To him, it showed a level of maturity and craftsmanship that few songwriters could achieve. For a man who often felt overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney, George wasn't shy about giving credit when it was due. And in this case, he genuinely believed Paul had created something special, something that transcended ego or rivalry. There was also a symbolic layer that George recognized. Abbey Road was recorded during the Beatles' slow disintegration, but "You Never Give Me Your Money" represented a kind of emotional honesty that few of their songs ever had. Paul wasn't pretending anymore. He wasn't hiding behind characters or nostalgia. He was expressing how it felt to watch the world's greatest band crumble under the weight of its own success. George respected that vulnerability. It reminded him that behind all the chaos, the Beatles were still capable of truth. And musically, the song hinted at where rock would go next. Its shifting movements and emotional range were a preview of what progressive rock would soon become, a fusion of pop melody, conceptual storytelling, and studio innovation. George, ever the musical explorer, appreciated that forward-thinking energy. When Abbey Road was finished, George contributed some of his finest work, Something and Here Comes the Sun, songs that finally earned him equal respect as a songwriter. But even with his own triumphs on the record, he still pointed to Paul's "You Never Give Me Your Money" as the emotional and musical centerpiece. To George, it was a perfect balance of feeling and form, a song that managed to capture everything the Beatles were going through without spelling it out. It was melancholy, nostalgic, and strangely optimistic. That optimism would carry through the medley, as You Never Give Me Your Money bled into Sun King, Mean Mr. Mustard, and the final suite that ends with The End, the last words the Beatles ever recorded together as a band. You Never Give Me Your Money wasn't just impressive to George, it was prophetic. It marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of something new. Looking back, it's telling that the song George Harrison called the most impressive wasn't his own. It wasn't a song about enlightenment or philosophy. It was about disillusionment, about facing the reality that dreams can fade, even for the greatest band in the world. But in that honesty, George found beauty. To him, Paul had done what great artists always do. He'd turned pain into something lasting. Abbey Road would be their farewell letter, and You Never Give Me Your Money was the emotional ink that tied it together, a reminder that even as the band fell apart, their music remained whole. And for George Harrison, that was the most impressive thing of all.